Hello. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think it's working. Can you see me? Okay. Okay. So can you hear me? Is the audio okay? Okay, well, thanks for the invitation to take part in this discussion or lead this discussion at Organizing the Unorganized. I should first say that I want to preface this discussion by saying that I am not an expert on this subject, although I've been following some of the debates, and I would highly recommend a number of important resources if you want to continue looking into this debate about organizing the unorganized, both in the South Asian context and the debates more globally. So one very important resource, I think, is the book by Rohini Hensman, Workers, Unions and Global Capitalism. It's a very useful book. I'd also highly recommend an article by Barbara Harris White and a co-author in Socialist Register, which I can give references of later. There's also some very useful material on organizing that is on the American website Labor Notes. They have a guide for organizing, and very important work, I think, coming out by Jane McAlevey. Jane McAlevey is a writer and labor organizer in the US who was, I think, done some of the most interesting work on organizing, on strike action, including in the unorganized sector. She's written a couple of books, and she also has a website which is called Jane McAlevey, McAlevey.com. So those are some good starting resources for starting this debate. So first thing I want to say is that clearly there has been a big expansion of the debate over the last few years on organizing unorganized sectors. This has taken place across the world. In the US, particularly around the Fight for $15 wage campaign, particularly in the fast food industry, in Amazon particularly, including at the moment, amongst cleaners, for example, in the UK. There have been some very successful campaigns, including at the London School of Economics, recently led by the IWGB, Independent Union. In France, which we'll get to maybe later, in call centers across the world, and of course in the global south. I think some of this debate, which is intensified by the coronavirus crisis, was prefigured by some debates about 10 years ago about social movement unionism, the idea of that trade unionism needs to move beyond its traditional forms of organizing and reach beyond just the workplace. And I think it took a particularly sharp form in the very successful strike led a few years ago in Chicago by the Chicago Teachers Union, and its successful ways of reaching out in the Chicago community amongst parents and more broadly in a strike that was successful. So anyway, there has been a very important development over the last couple of years, I think, pushing the idea of the importance of organizing the unorganized. And it's clearly a combination of two phenomena. On the one hand, there is a global crisis of trade unionism across the world. You are all aware, I'm sure, that trade unionism has declined massively since the high points in the 1970s, and the declines are continuing. There's more resistance, if you like, to the decline in the public sectors generally, but in private sector, it's very sharp declines. And there seems to be a strategic crisis in the trade union movement about how to address that decline. And that's also accompanied by decline of traditional forms of labor resistance, like strike action. And on the other hand, the other phenomenon that combines with this is the expansion of neoliberalism across the world and its disastrous impact on the ability to organize, particularly due to subcontracting, the spread of disciplinary, highly disciplinary work surveillance, anti-worker legislation. I mean, I think you know the whole story about neoliberalism and its effect. So I think one interesting thing that's come out straight away from this has been to dispel a number of myths. One myth that was pushed at the beginning of the 1980s was the myth of post-materialism. This was the idea that the labor movement was dead or stagnant, but that the new social movements, what were known as the new social movements, feminist movement, ecology movement, peace movement, and so on, would take its place. And what was characteristic about these movements, according to these theories, was that they were post-materialist. They were not about fighting for material interests. They were about fighting for other kinds of interests, such as defense of the environment. And this was an idea that was pushed very strongly by anti-Marxist theorists in the 1980s. I think it's clear now that the effects of neoliberalism and the creation of precarious forms of employment, particularly for those sectors of the population that were supposedly affected by new social movements, particularly women, for example, has not at all led to some disappearance of the importance of material interests. It's reconfigured them, but material interests have remained crucial and central. The other kind of idea that was quite popular more recently around the turn of the century, the beginning of the 2000s, was the idea that the unorganized, if you like, those sectors of the working population who were not involved in organized labor were constituted a separate class, a precariat of precarious workers who were in some way very distinct from the employed and unionized sections of the population, or the idea that they were part of what was known as the multitude, so something much, much bigger than the working class. I think also that idea has come under a lot of pressure just through the effects of the crisis of neoliberalism. And I think there are more productive debates happening now about how to understand the working class broadly, in a broad sense, particularly the contribution of what's known as social reproduction theory, the importance of reproductive labor, particularly women's labor, but not only, inside and outside the workplace. But anyway, that's a separate debate. So I think this conjuncture is interesting because it's got rid of a number of, or marginalized a number of notions that that labor is, passé, is something of the past, but it does pose real new problems for us. I think there are two mirror images, if you like, of, problematic responses. One is a bureaucratic response by many trade unions across the world, which is that either a reluctance to engage with organizing unorganized workers because they don't have the same characteristics as the traditional working class, often younger, often from different sectors of the population, with a different relationship to work, higher turnover, for example, and much less respectful, if you like, of the traditional structures of the labor movement. So reluctance to engage with them even, or a slide into service unionism, the idea that, trade unionism is just about providing services to its members, no longer about building combative workplace opposition. Or a third kind of bureaucratic response has been the notion that they could respond to this crisis simply through symbolic top-down actions. And we can go into that, but there have been various initiatives, particularly in the US, to organize what's known as corporate campaigns against particular companies, to put pressure on them, but which don't involve the rebuilding of power at the workplace level, but involve various forms of media campaign and pressure, often leading to behind the doors negotiations. So that's been one problematic response. I think the mirror problematic response has been the rejection as basically a dead end of workplace organizing, and an embrace of, if you like, the so-called spontaneous, more, if you like, quote unquote, radical forms of resistance, rejection of all structures, rejection of all mediations, rejection of all trade union structures. The idea, if you like, of the riot replacing the strike. And I say so-called spontaneous because as a old friend and comrade, Colin Barker, who was a great student of social movements, used to insist when people talk about spontaneous movements, it's simply a way of saying you don't know enough about those movements, because no movements are purely spontaneous. There are always active forces, leading forces within them. But anyway, a rejection of all workplace. So I think both those responses, the kind of bureaucratic response of avoiding it or trying to find false, quick solutions that involve avoiding the hard work of rebuilding workplace organization, and the rejection of organized labor as such, are very problematic. There has been an interesting counter-reaction to that, which is the attempt to revive the notion of the workers' inquiry, the idea of activists and scholars engaging with workers in the workplace to discuss the real problems that they face and find real hooks and ways into organizing at a practical level. Anyway, I think these responses are responding to a real issue, which is the problem of trade union decline, which we mentioned before. Trade union decline is driven by both objective factors, the structural changes of the global capitalist economy, and subjective factors, how the unions have responded to this. And in many ways, in many places, the unions have responded very badly through attempted forms of class compromise and, as I said, service unionism. There's been a growth, I think, of an appeal to kind of shortcuts, trying to get out of this crisis. One is the corporate campaign I referred to earlier, the naming and shaming of enterprises as an alternative to building workplace organization. The proclamation of fake strikes, which are not really strikes, which are not really built at the grassroots. And electoralism has been an important shortcut, the notion that campaigning for progressive candidates is a way of solving the problem that the unions face. I think that what has come out of the most recent debates about organizing is that there are no shortcuts, that organizing the unorganized is very hard long-term work, and that nothing replaces the centrality of democratic rank-and-file-oriented structures. That trade union leaders, organizers, advisors, and so on can play a useful role, but they cannot substitute for democratic organization at the workplace. And so this whole issue of bureaucratization and substituting for workers' self-activity has become much debated. I think one way of thinking about organizing the unorganized also has been that trade unionism has to widen its range of campaigns and of attentiveness to what it considers to be key issues for unorganized workers. So there is a notion that, trade unionism should only be concerned with so-called economic issues, to do with wages, to do with work contracts. And I think it's clear from many of the successful campaigns to organize the more precarious sectors of the workplace that health and safety issues are also very crucial, particularly at the moment, for example, in the context of coronavirus, but more generally, including new attentiveness to issues of mental health, the stress, if you like, the effects of the stress of the neoliberal workplace on workers' mental health, questions of harassment, particularly sexual harassment in the workplace, questions of discrimination along racial lines, caste lines, religious lines, and so on. And political issues are also issues that trade unions have to address if they want to organize the unorganized. So the notion that trade unions could simply focus on so-called economic issues and hide away from this much broader range of issues, I think has been dispelled, and it's rather that trade unions have to widen their scope of intervention across these lines if they want to be able to appeal to unorganized sectors. I think another important aspect has been the need for trade unions to build relationships of allyship to other sectors. One of the successful things that happened with the unionization of the London School of Economics cleaners, for example, was the role of the students in supporting the trade union organization there, not substituting for workers' action, but lending a hand in disruptive activity, direct action, to make things difficult for the university hierarchy and force the issue not to be avoided. Of course, there are problems with all these forms of intervention, which we can discuss at greater length. One of them, when I talked about politics, for example, in the broad sense of the term, the need to take on political issues, is that there is a bad tradition within the trade union movement, as we know. Well, two bad traditions. One is the separation of economics and politics. Politics is for parties who engage in elections and build up programs, and economics is for trade unions. And so just simply replicating the division between politics and economics of capitalism. The other is politics in a very narrow sense of trade unions being a transmission belt for a particular political party, which has also had a very bad history in many countries of the world. What I wanted to talk about in the last few minutes, because we don't have much time just for this introduction, is I wanted to give one concrete example of the relationship between trade unions and the unorganized, which is perhaps unfamiliar to you because it's not. It's neither the model of organizing small sectors of, for example, cleaners or call center workers, or the big problem of, the massive problem of unorganized labor in India. I wanted to take the example of the French yellow vest, Gilets jaunes movement that happened in 2018. The Gilets jaunes movement, if you followed it, if you remember it, was a very, very big movement of, it was a plebeian movement, wasn't a straightforwardly working class movement. It also involved self-employed and small business people in some cases, housewives and husbands, and so on. It was quite distrustful of the trade union movement, and vice versa. The trade union movement was at the beginning very distrustful of it, but it was a mass movement. Took very different forms of action from trade unions, didn't engage in strikes, but occupied spaces, roundabouts, for example, or public spaces within towns. And it was a very radical movement, very almost insurrectional movement. At various points in the big demonstrations that took place in Paris, there was talk of the president having to prepare his helicopter to escape if they, stormed the Élysée Palace, and very, hard conflicts with the police. Lots of people were injured by police action. So it was a very powerful, big mass movement of a sector of the population that had no organic relationship to trade union organization whatsoever. In fact, was quite hostile or indifferent towards traditional trade union organization. I cite this example for two reasons. First of all, because I think it's the highest point of political mobilization by unorganized sections of the population. Really was a very big and powerful movement, even if it was very diverse and ideologically mixed, and there was no clear program or leadership or any of these kinds of things. Still a very important movement. And I think it prefigures kinds of movements we're likely to see in the future under the forms of neoliberalized politics and economics that we face. But I also cite it because it's interesting, because the year after the Yellow Vest movement, we had the all the way through the autumn of last year until January, really, we had a massive strike movement in France of particularly railway workers and metro workers, but across the public sector, striking against pension reforms that the Macron government was pushing through. And this was a very powerful strike movement. It was the longest strike action in France, I think, since records began. It also had a very radical element to it, and there was clearly an interpenetration between what had happened the year before through the Yellow Vest movement and this big strike movement, almost 3 months. I think various things can be drawn from that experience that are interesting for us to bear in mind. First of all, the attitude, as I said, of the trade unions initially to the Yellow Vest movement was extreme suspicion, defensiveness. They weren't sure what this movement was, how to identify it. and because it did not address traditional trade union issues of wages, for example, it was more about the cost of living generally. As you may remember, it started off as a protest against fuel tax. So not wages, fuel taxes. But also because it was a more political movement in the sense its main slogan was that the president should resign. And there were various other political demands about direct democracy and so on. The trade unions were very suspicious of it and kept their distance from it. But I think that the influence that the Yellow Vest movement has had on last year's big trade union-led strike action is important. So it shows that if trade unionism has to consider itself as being interdependent with these new forms of action. I think also what's very interesting about the movement is the role of women. Women played a very key role in the Yellow Vest movement, and women also played a very key role in the strike movement. And there were big women's delegations within the strikers' demonstrations that were clearly influenced by some of the debates about the Yellow Vest movement had put on the table about, if you like, social reproduction, about the role of all these forms of invisible labor and caring labor, not just industrial labor. The strike movement also put at the front of people's consciousness the role of precarious workers, not just the employed, stable workers, but precarious workers. For example, in the universities, the precariously employed workers played a very prominent role. And it led to perhaps a more reflexive use of the strike not just as a tool for winning particular demands, or maybe in some far-off future an insurrectional mass strike that would create dual power, but the strike as a politicizing tool. So I think if you put all of these debates together, and there are many other things we could go into, I think it's clear that the challenges for the trade union movement facing organizing unorganized sectors are the need, well, first of all, of course, to take them seriously, these unorganized sectors, and to adapt structurally, to be more flexible, to be able to relate to them in different ways from the ways that they relate to already organized sections. The use of new tools, including, of course, social media, which was very important in the Yellow Vest movement. For example, Facebook was an organizing tool for the Yellow Vest, are very important. The opening up of the union movement from a defensive posture to a much more broad movement that accepts the diversity of the working class as it currently exists, and a willingness to take on a political role, a politically interventionist role, because many of these unorganized movements, or so-called unorganized workers' movements, have political demands at their center, not straightforward economic ones. And if politics is left simply to electoral politics or to party politics, the unions are not going to be able to bring in these new sectors and incorporate their demands and their energy and their potential to a revitalized union movement. So that's a very quick and superficial introduction to the discussion that we can continue. But I hope it had some use. And I've well gone over my time, I'm afraid. So how does the discussion happen now? Purely questions, or purely written questions? Is that right? Okay, so moving up to the various questions. So there's one question here about there are some people who claim class is relative, not it is not an absolute sense, and in India it's impossible to use it as a unifying category for the Indian poor. What is your opinion on that? Well, I think that this goes into the debates about whether you have a so-called essentialist or so-called constructivist notion of the working class. If you like to put it crudely, the essentialist notion of the working class is that there's a working class that objectively exists because of its position in the relations of production, and that and it's often allied to a notion that this working class is essentially revolutionary, and the only reason that it's not revolutionary is because it's been misled, because of false consciousness or bad leadership or whatever. And then there's the so-called constructivist notion of the working class, which is that the working class is it's a social, political, and cultural construction. It's not a thing. It's constructed through struggles over periods of time, including by cultural processes, and that there is not a kind of rigid essence to the working class, which predisposes it to certain forms of action. I think obviously the constructivist notion is much more useful, and in a constructivist notion you can understand why unions and leftist forces could construct a notion of the working class which is much more open, much more able to integrate sections of the urban poor and rural poor and so on into its definition and to its self-understanding. I don't think that taking that perspective means that you reject the idea of the role of the working class in producing value in the value production system. I think that remains important. But I think the debates, for example, that are happening at the moment about social reproduction theory mean that we shouldn't conceive of the working class simply as industrial or simply as this or that sector, that we have to understand the role of production and reproduction in a more holistic, totalizing kind of way. There were debates in the 1970s, very fruitless debates, I think, about productive and unproductive labor, and that certain sections of the working class were engaged in productive labor, which was directly value producing, and others were involved in unproductive labor, and some theorists only took the productive labor section of the working class as the real working class, and the rest were sections of the petty bourgeoisie or whatever. I think those debates are not helpful anymore. And I think we need an expansive notion of the working class, but one that is that doesn't cut off the notion of the working class from its role within the production and reproduction of the capitalist system. That's obviously a bigger debate. As I say, I think it's connected to the debates about social reproduction. Okay, so then there's a question about Kerala. The formation of the Dinesh BD cooperatives in Kerala was an attempt to resist the informalization of the production process. When capital found it easy to channel workers through home-based production rather than factory-based production to avoid a militant labor movement, the workers' movement came up with the idea of cooperatives. Do you think such cooperative responses would be useful? Yes, of course, cooperative responses can be useful, and all Marxist theorists, Marx and Lenin included, placed importance on cooperative movements, which existed in England, for example, Marx's time, began to develop at quite expansively, and cooperatives were part of the labor movement, along with trade unions, political parties, and workers' education societies, and so on. So I think that yes, there are cooperatives can clearly be, in some circumstances, an interesting response, especially to the kinds of processes you're discussing, or to plant closings and so on. And there have been various, famous workers' cooperatives that have been produced that have, marked the history of the labor movement. I think the problem, of course, with cooperatives is that they are islands, and they, to the extent that they exist in a capitalist sea, if you like, of that is governed by the law of value, they will be subject to those pressures, and that it's very difficult to scale out cooperatives. Having a sector of the economy under cooperative ownership is, of course, a positive thing, but it doesn't challenge the law of value unless you're able to scale it up. And it's you could imagine situations where you have left governments who are prepared to push cooperatives at a state level, and give them support and so on. But it's very difficult to imagine cooperatives becoming sufficiently important to challenge capitalist mode of production without, at some point, taking on the question of state power and of the large and the role of large capital. One shouldn't idealize cooperatives. There are many cooperatives which start off very well, and then not due to any evil intent, but due to the pressures on them, market competition and so on, start reproducing structures of capitalist hierarchy and inequality within them. They're a partial defensive response often. Then there's a question about trade union bureaucracy. It's very real in a lot of unions in third world countries. How do you see this in the light of the relevance of reading and reinterpreting Trotsky in modern times? Well, yes, trade union bureaucracies exist across the world, including in third world countries or developing countries, in the global south more generally. And of course, the specificity of the global south is that often they're incorporated much more readily into clientelist state structures. The famous example being Argentina with Peronism. The Peron and Peronist regimes were able to integrate the trade unions into their state machine, and they became transmission belts for the Peronist party and Peronist government. So the argument about bureaucracy is very important. I think there is a problem about a very binary opposition between rank and file and bureaucracy, which can exist in some groups, because bureaucratization is a process that affects all organizations at all different levels. So you can have bureaucratization. Of course, you can have very sharp contrasts. Well-paid, full-time, leaders of unions versus rank and file workers. But within all the intermediate grades, including workers who simply get time off work in order to carry out union roles, you could see aspects of gap and what you might call privilege, including material privilege or symbolic privilege, between union organizers and workers, and rank and file workers. And bureaucratization is a problem that affects all workers' organizations, even after the Russian Revolution. In the factory committees after 1917, there were bureaucratization processes right from the beginning of the revolution onwards in the factory committees, and of course later on in the Soviets and in the in society in general. So bureaucratization is a real problem. Trotsky can help, as can other Marxist theorists. And I think, a firm centrality on rank and file democratic processes is one way of struggling against bureaucracy, but I think you also have to accept that bureaucratization is, as I say, a process that is constantly reproduced by the division of labor between intellectual and manual labor, and also the pressures of a capitalist economy. And so it's not something you can get rid of by the waving of a magic wand or denunciation of bureaucrats. The relevance of unionization in post-industrial societies. Well, I mean, it depends what we mean by post-industrial societies. This idea of post-industrial societies was very linked to the earlier trends I mentioned about new social movements and post-materialism, the idea that we'd moved beyond industrial societies or Fordist societies, or and that new social movements were more suited to these post-industrial times. I'm not sure it's very helpful to think in terms of industrial and post-industrial. I mean, the so-called post-industrial societies, i.e. those of the developed capitalist world, rely on the industrial societies of the global south, on the sweatshops and factories in Asia, South Asia, East Asia, and beyond. So they're not that post-industrial. Just because you don't see the factories in the US or in the UK, and that their economies have become reconfigured towards services or finance and so on, doesn't mean that they're post-industrial. Just try. Well, we can see in the current circumstances how the collapse of international trade, including trade in manufactured goods, is having a disastrous effect on all the developed capitalist economies. So I think unionization is not affected by, I think it's a false dichotomy, industrial, post-industrial. What is your opinion on union partnership with employers and working for the benefit of customers who ultimately benefit the laborers, basically social partner? Well, I think social partnership unionism has been the key to the crisis that we are in. I mean, I think from the 1980s onwards, almost all the major trade unions, certainly in the developed capitalist world, and I think in large parts of the global south as well, accepted this idea of social partnership unionism. And if the result has been absolutely disastrous for workers' conditions, for wages, which have remained stagnant even in advanced economies like the US, for the deleterious effects of neoliberalism on working people's lives. I mean, I think social partnership unionism is, it's based on the idea that there is some kind of social peace that's compromise that is achievable between labor and capital at the very moment when that compromise, the material basis for that compromise, has disappeared. I mean, for a few decades in the post-war period, you could argue that social democracy and some kind of redistributive role of unions could be based on a kind of class compromise. But neoliberalism is the opposite of class compromise. It's class offensive. So the notion that you could overcome a class offensive through, social partnership unionism is simply suicidal. And I think it's been blown out of the water and completely discredited since. Trade unions have to a large extent depended on the public sector, at least here in India. How do you think they operate in a scenario where the gig economy predominates? Also, the economist and conservative currents historically have preponderance over radical change. Okay, I don't really understand the second part of the question, but the first question, yes. What I said at the beginning is that one of the impacts of the decline of trade unionism globally has been the places where it has resisted, even though it's also declined, are the public sector, and that's where most of the widespread resistance in terms of strike action has taken place in the public sector. And in the private sector, it's largely collapsed. Trade union density in the private sector across the world has largely collapsed. And yes, this leads to a big divide between, on the one hand, public sector workers who have some kinds of guarantees, often in terms of employment stability and salaries, and younger gig workers who are disposable workers almost. But that's the whole point, I think, of this discussion, is about how trade unions need to be able to reimagine themselves, reinvent themselves, so that they can bring in those gig economy workers, because without them, they are going to die. Trade unions are simply going to become like dinosaurs unless they're able to relate to those new sections. There have been some very successful attempts to relate to gig economy workers. I mentioned, for example, the IWGB in the UK, which has been very successful in organising some sections of delivery workers, for example. Similarly in France, bicycle delivery workers and so on. However, these are small examples because these are small organisations, independent unions trying to organise them. The established trade union movement has not put its energy and vigour behind trying to relate to these new sections that it should. And as I say, it is cutting off its nose to spite its face, because these are the sources of rejuvenation of the trade union movement. What is your opinion on the process of antagonist positions within class formation in modern times? Have third world countries reached the stage of what Eric Olin Wright and Poulantzas were debating about the middle classes back in the day? Yes, there have been large processes of class differentiation and formation in developing countries. China, obviously, India also, and middle classes have been created. I think we need to be careful with the notion of middle class, particularly in a developing country, because it doesn't mean necessarily the same thing that it means in developed capitalist economies. And even in developed capitalist economies, it's become, sometimes it's an analytical term that Marxists use and other social scientists. Sometimes it's like a moral label. So, many working class Americans describe themselves as middle class because it means that they're, they have a stable job. It doesn't mean that they're actually middle class in our sense of the term. But yeah, there have been real middle classes that have been created, obviously, as the process of neoliberalization has advanced in the global south. And I do think that Eric Olin Wright's work, less Poulantzas, because of the debates about productive and unproductive labor I mentioned earlier, I don't think are very useful. But I think that Eric Olin Wright's work on what he calls contradictory class locations, and the development of intermediary layers that are not part of the old petty bourgeoisie, the new middle class, as it's called, are very important. And I think, yes, one of the important questions politically in the next 10, 20 years is how those layers are going to respond politically. Are they going to be more attracted towards far right or radical left kinds of responses to the crisis? It could go either way. On the one hand, their conditions are being undermined, for example, by the kind of crisis that we're living through today. On the other hand, we know that the middle class is traditionally the social basis for reactionary mass movements, such as fascism. But we also know that there are generational issues. So we know that, for example, the children of middle class people, for example, in the US, so-called millennials, face very different, much less positive life prospects, living conditions than did their parents. And many of those are the troops, if you like, for the new left that's developing in the US around the Democratic Socialists of America and other forces. The new socialist movement in America is to some extent fueled by the children of middle class parents, and that's a good thing. It's problematic, but it's definitely a good thing. How would you evaluate Marxist theoretical schools, Italian autonomism, for example, which are critical towards trade union politics? Well, I think there are different strands within autonomism and workerism, and some clearly are totally hostile to trade union, any trade union structures. See them as kulaks, if you like, as repressive forces over the insurgent power of workers, and I think that's really problematic. But I think that a critical appropriation of some of the very useful things in autonomism is possible. I mentioned earlier on this idea of workers' inquiry, or co-research, the idea of workers, of scholars and activists researching particular workplaces and work environments and so on, fueled by the self-activity of the workers who are there, and being able to help the workers work out their own practical forms of struggle and action. That's very useful, and that's been put into practice by certainly some of the smaller autonomous unions. There's a good book produced by a friend of mine called Jamie Woodcock about call center workers, where he tries to integrate some of the themes of workers' inquiry, and I think that's a very positive thing. So I think we have to be careful. There are different strands within autonomism, some of which are more useful than others. With the gig economy expanding, it has been observed that there have been several out-of-court settlements when it comes to litigation for securing workers' rights, or even to have them recognized as workers instead of independent contractors. Often these settlements are reached paying more than what the litigation itself would have compensated. How does trade union movement prepare for this new normal? Well, I don't think why is it new normal? I mean, it's an old normal that workers' struggles and workers' organization often, when it's successful, takes a legislative form. That's not the primary form it takes. The primary form it takes is workers' organized resistance. But that can lead to situations where states and governments have to respond, and do respond positively by legislating. The legislation for the 8-hour day and so on was the product of workers' self-activity. So I don't see why it's a new normal. I think it's interesting that these court cases have been successful. In France, for example, it's put the Deliveroo and Uber and so on the back foot, because it means their whole economic model is completely threatened by the fact that they have to pay social security, sick pay, holiday pay, and so on, and they're fighting it through appeals. And I think the window is still open about what will develop there. But I don't think there's anything qualitatively new about that. Trade unions do need to have a legislative side. Of course, they need to take legislative action. But it should not substitute for workers' self-activity, and the basis should be workers' self-activity, which then can take the form of legislative and legal challenges. But I think these can set legal precedents, which are very useful in other countries to be able to push through improvements in gig workers' conditions. think there was a quote I quite liked from an article Jane McAlevey wrote, which I think is interesting. She's arguing against the kind of top-down bureaucratic initiatives of unions, and she writes the following in her conclusion, which I think is very good. She says, New Labour, or the New Labour movement, desperately needs to return to bottom-up base building as its core strategy. This means work-site-based organising, where workers are aided by skilled organisers, but not replaced by them, where workers themselves are the primary actors and primary leverage of their own self-organisation. At this point, we have almost no organisation left amongst private sector workers. Strategy and tactics matter, but we cannot jujitsu our way out of this mess. Furthermore, it is time to acknowledge that growth strategies and theories that rely on giving workers less say in the workplace only compound the problems of unaccountability that put the New Labour movement, she's talking about the trade union movement in the US, and their promises of reform in power in the first place. To be most effective, to stand a chance of achieving large-scale revitalization, unions have to return to an organizing model closer to that of the CIO of the 1920s and 30s tradition, 1930s tradition. It's the only route back to being capable of running an effective strike, let alone occupying Wall Street. Symbolic protests are helpful, but strategic power has to be built. And today, given differences in the relationship to the broader community implied by service workers versus factory production workers, the organizing model must systematically extend charting and list work, which are two techniques she talks about as the CIO model, into the broader community. By first identifying organic leaders in the workplace and by enabling workers to sharpen their understanding of how to win tough fights, Labour can grow an army that will meaningfully engage with its own organic network in the broader community and in the political arena. This model offers a way to overcome the silos that have been identified by some scholars, and because it structures class into the community via rank and file union members. This is a considerably different approach from today's Labour community coalitions, which reinforce rather than resolve this divide between Labour and communities. It's a very good article called The Crisis of New Labour and Alinsky's Legacy. I mean, it's concentrated on the US case, but I think it has interesting arguments, and I think anybody interested in these debates should go to her website, Jane McAlevey, McAlevey, and of course look at the other references I mentioned, like Rahini Hensman's book, Hensman, and his useful article in Socialist Register by Barbara Harris-White, which is called Mapping India's World of Unorganized Labour, Nandini Guptu and Barbara Harris-White. Yeah, I won't respond about the Frankfurt School and consumerism, because that's going to lead us into a long discussion. There's a question about Frankfurt School arguing that mass consumption is liquidating the emancipatory potential of trade union politics. I think that's completely wrong, but it's the subject for a much longer discussion. Okay. Have a good evening.